Hello, my name's John Mills, and today I'm going to talk to you about etymology and the relexification of Cornish in the 20th century. I shall begin by giving some of the historical background to the Cornish language, in order to put things into context. I shall then go on to talk about how the lexicon of Cornish was expanded to meet the needs of Cornish language revivalists. And finally, I shall talk about how the lexicon has been reshaped by relexification, largely as a result of the work of one individual. But first, let us look at the historical background to the Cornish language. We can see from this Stambaum diagram that Cornish is a Brythonic Celtic language, and its closest related languages are Welsh and Breton. The core vocabulary of Cornish is Celtic. We can see from this table that the core vocabulary of Cornish has cognates in the other insular Celtic languages, which stem from Proto-Celtic etyma. Thus, gŵr, a man, stems from Proto-Celtic wiro. Bain, a woman, stems from Proto-Celtic bena. Awon, a river, stems from Proto-Celtic awos. Glyn, a valley, stems from Proto-Celtic glenos. March, a horse, stems from Proto-Celtic markos. Buch, a cow, stems from Proto-Celtic bow. And moch, pigs, stems from Proto-Celtic mucus. Following the Norman invasion of 1066, many Old Norman French loanwords entered the Cornish language, just as they did for English. The Cornish language was substantially expanded in the fields of government and administration, law, the military, equinety and chivalry, religion, learning and education, medicine, architecture, commerce, food, music, and fashion and clothing. Thus we find the Middle Cornish maestri, borrowed from Old Norman French maestria, dominion, power, or authority. We find the Middle Cornish acheson, borrowed from Old Norman French acheson, an accusation or charge. Middle Cornish guerilla, from Old Norman French guerriere, to make war. Middle Cornish chivalry, from Old Norman French chevaleria, chivalry. Middle Cornish pechadur, from Old Norman French pécheur, a sinner. Middle Cornish apposia, from Old Norman French apposer, to examine. Middle Cornish saument, from Old Norman French saument, a cure or a remedy. Middle Cornish ostel, from Old Norman French ostel, a house or a home. Middle Cornish scot, from Old Norman French escot, meaning a payment or share of the bill. And Middle Cornish acel, from Old Norman French acel, meaning vinegar. Some relexification also took place during this period, in which Old Cornish words are replaced by Old Norman French words. Thus, the Old Cornish word meal, an animal, is replaced by Old Norman French beest in Middle Cornish. Old Cornish blodorn, a flower, is replaced by the Old Norman French fleur. Old Cornish cadwr, a soldier, is replaced by Old Norman French sudor. Old Cornish ehoc is replaced by Old Norman French salmain, a salmon. Old Cornish elerch is replaced by Old Norman French swan, a swan. Old Cornish telein, a harp, is replaced by Old Norman French harp. Old Cornish arwan, a river, is replaced by Old Norman French river. And Old Cornish eneb, a face, is replaced by Old Norman French face. Of course, Middle Cornish shares many Old Norman French loanwords with Middle English. The resemblance of these loanwords to their present-day English counterparts has been seen as undesirable by some language revivalists, as we shall see later. Of course, Cornish also borrowed words from Middle English, words that have Old English etyma. I have previously shown how in Middle Cornish religious drama these reflexes of Old English items and their Middle Cornish synonyms tend to function as sociolinguistic variables. The Middle English loanwords are spoken by the evil characters in the plays, whilst their Celtic Cornish synonyms are used by the good characters. Thus, charm alternates with meth, talcia alternates with causal, to speak or talk. Hardy Grarth alternates with diel, vengeance. Heil alternates with luenadis, hello or hail. Sket alternates with scorn, immediately. Snell alternates with scorn, quickly. Soul alternates with enev, soul. Stap alternates with cam, a step. Wela woe alternates with go thee, alas. And sharp alternates with Middle Cornish furv, shape or form. I'll give just a few examples to illustrate how these variables work in Middle Cornish drama. In the play Goreans and Beers, when the wicked serpent speaks to Eve, he uses the Middle English loanword shama, shame. Shame you genef the glues, how cred ye then girio na. I have shame to hear you believing those words. But when, after eating the forbidden apple, Adam and Eve discover they are naked, then when Adam speaks to Eve, he prefers the Proto-Celtic reflex meth. Rag meth, dein neolema, the gutha in terror clause. For shame, let's go and hide somewhere close by. In the play Bewnans Moriazic, a tyrant uses the Middle English loanword snell, quick. Duch genevi decempus elema than guelvos snell. Come with me at once to the forest, quickly. But in the play Origo Mundi, the angel cherubim prefers the Proto-Celtic reflex scorn. The paradise scorneth av, to paradise quickly I go. And in the play Passio Domini, an executioner uses the Middle English loanword soul, a soul. Henna miara rum soul. That I will do upon my soul. Whereas Jesus prefers the Proto-Celtic reflex enev. Rag ima in our enev tristins fast bis in ankau. For there is in my soul great sadness, even unto death. This map shows the westward decline of the Cornish language between 1200 AD and 1750. It is usually thought that Cornish had become extinct by the end of the 18th century. There is, however, some scant and inconclusive evidence that a few Cornish speakers may have continued to exist into the late 19th century. The revival of the Cornish language began when Henry Jenner published his Handbook of the Cornish Language in 1904. Jenner famously wrote, "Why should Cornishmen learn Cornish? There is no money in it, it serves no practical purpose, and the literature is scanty and of no great originality or value. The question is a fair one. The answer is simple. Because they are Cornish." Beginning in the 1930s, Robert Morton Nance and A.S.D. Smith together compiled 4 dictionaries. In the preface to their 1934 An English Cornish Dictionary, Nance and Smith explain their aims thus. In preparing this English Cornish dictionary of approximately 12,000 words, its compilers have had as their chief aim that of removing its greatest stumbling block to the free use of Cornish as a spoken and written language, the lack of an adequate vocabulary. They explain their method for expanding the lexicon of Cornish as follows. Where Cornish sources seem to fail, words have been cautiously introduced from Breton and Welsh, usually from both together, and put into what seems to be their most likely Cornish form. This would seem to be a fair method. If the sister languages of Cornish have cognate pairs of words, then it is a reasonable assumption that Middle Cornish would have had this word, even if it is not attested in the corpus of Middle Cornish. Nance and Smith also borrowed words from Cornish dialect English. They explain their rationale thus. In borrowing words from Cornish English dialect, care has been taken to use only such as are not part of the general West Country English dialect, but are genuinely Celtic, or at least such as are likely to have been used in the period of Middle Cornish. Nance sums up his methodology for expanding the Cornish lexicon when he writes in 1938 that his dictionary includes many words which can only be presumed to have formed part of the language. Here we see an extract from Nance's 1938 Cornish English Dictionary. Baal, a plague or pest, is marked with a dagger symbol to indicate that it is taken from Old Cornish and respelled as Middle Cornish. Below that we find its homograph, Baal, a white spot in a horse's brow, marked with an asterisk to indicate that this is a reconstruction on the basis of Welsh and Breton cognates. Below that, a further homograph, Baal, mine or tin workings, is marked D to indicate that it is found in Cornish dialect English. Next we see Balek, Balch and Balchter, marked with asterisks to indicate that they are reconstructions based on Welsh and Breton cognates. Banallen is marked C. Voc, citing an Old Cornish attestation of this item, and D indicating that it is also found in Cornish dialect English. In 1993, Kesva and Tavis Cernewick published Ken George's Gairliver Cernewick Kemen, the purpose of which was to launch a new orthography for Cornish. George's dictionary also prescribes what George believes should and should not be included in the lexicon of revived 20th century Cornish. In his preface, George describes his aims thus: "This dictionary does not set out to give the occurrence of every word in traditional Cornish. Indeed, this dictionary is prescriptive rather than descriptive." This prescriptive orientation of George's 1993 dictionary is evident by his proscribing loanwords that resemble present-day English forms. George proscribes those words that were borrowed into Middle Cornish from Old Norman French when they resemble present-day English words. In these examples, George recommends Old Cornish forms which had died out by the Middle Cornish period over Middle Cornish forms borrowed from Old Norman French. Thus George proscribes Middle Cornish saumen in favour of Old Cornish ehoc. He proscribes Middle Cornish swan in favour of Old Cornish alach. He proscribes Middle Cornish harp in favour of Old Cornish tellin, and he proscribes Middle Cornish river in favour of Old Cornish arwan. But George goes further by recommending certain words that resemble present-day English words be replaced by neologisms constructed from Celtic Cornish morphemes. Thus George recommends that the Middle Cornish word adhere be replaced by the neologism cewara. Further examples include Middle Cornish banshia to be replaced by the neologism divroa, Middle Cornish bouquet to be replaced by the neologism kelorn, and Middle Cornish article to be replaced by the neologism erthagal. However, loanwords that do not resemble present-day English are not proscribed by George. Here are some examples of Old Norman French words that were borrowed into Middle Cornish and appear without proscription in George's Gairliver Mer. Acheson, from Old Norman French acheson, an accusation or charge. Pechador, from Old Norman French pechedur, a sinner. Aposia, from Old Norman French apposer, to examine. Saument, from Old Norman French saument, a cure or remedy. Scote, from Old Norman French escote, a payment or share of the bill. And eisel, from Old Norman French esel, vinegar. Furthermore, George does not proscribe words that were borrowed into Middle Cornish from Middle English, so long as they do not resemble present-day English words. Examples include splat, a plot of ground. Nevra, always. Shindia, to hurt. Bismer, infamy. Clap, chatter. Drylia, to drag. Skila, a reason. And yet, a gate. Here is an excerpt from George's Gairliver Mer. The headwords smart and snell, both loanwords from Middle English, are in bold type to indicate that they are recommended for use in revived Cornish. The head word smooth, also a loan word from Middle English, does not appear in bold, because George does not recommend its use in revived Cornish. George writes, use guastus, or leaven. Presumably, George dislikes smooth because, for him, it bears too close a resemblance to present-day English smooth. However, George finds smart and snell acceptable because they bear no obvious resemblance to present-day English. The English translation equivalents and neologisms given in George's Gairliver Cernowic Cemin entail a contrastive lexicology that is at odds with traditional practice as attested in the historical corpus of Cornish. George writes, Nance tended to give a large number of meanings, even to words which appear only once in the texts. In Gairliver Cernowic Cemin, the number of meanings has, in general, been limited to 3 or less. Morton Nance, in his 1938 dictionary, gives the following equivalents for denithy: to give birth to, beget, bring forth, and generate. In his 1993 dictionary, George gives only give birth. George has decided to drop beget, bring forth, and generate. Now, if we examine the medieval texts, in Origo Mundi we find Hagevara deniddi un map da heb falado, and he shall beget a goodly son undoubtedly. And in Passio Domini we find Mab deu pur hadein kefris avatith golan denithis, son of very God, and man also, of a pure virgin born. The one equivalent given by George is clearly not satisfactory for these examples. What George appears to have done is take the translation equivalents given by Nance and reduce the number without any recourse to historical usage. The Cornish word neger can be translated into English as swim, float, or fly. Some speakers of Cornish have sought to disambiguate by introducing the neologism nervia. They then use nervia to translate swim and neger to translate fly. In this manner, the semantic structure of Cornish can be made to mirror that of English. However, it might be argued that this is unnecessary, since the particular sense of neger can usually be determined from the context. Middle Cornish has a dual form for parts of the body that come in pairs. Deolagus, a pair of eyes. Deolev, hands. Deolin, knees. Thus we find in the miracle play Passio Domini, Miathpis asauia audeolagus, I pray you to cure my eyes. During the 20th century, this dual form has spawned a number of Cornish neologisms. Thus, duros, literally a pair of wheels, is used to translate bicycle. From this, the verbs durosa, to cycle, and durosia, to go on a cycle tour, are derived. Similarly, deweder translates a pair of glasses, or spectacles. Dowdhain, a pair of people, translates a couple. Dowbris, literally a pair of spouses, refers to a married couple. The adjective diwyethek translates bilingual, and from diwyethek, the noun diwyethegeth, bilingualism, is derived. Tourism is very much a 20th century phenomenon in Cornwall. So, the ways in which the English word tourist may be translated into Cornish are particularly relevant. There are 7 possible Cornish translation equivalents for tourist: viagia, terviagia, tornius, havius, guandrius, tourist, and troilia. Their morphological derivation reveals how they semantically differ from one another. The notion of tourists as people whose presence in Cornwall is temporary is reflected in tornius, which derives from torn, an occasion or time, and ias, agency noun ending. Havias, from hav, summer, and ias specifies the time of year when tourists are particularly prevalent in Cornwall. The notion of tourists as people who are in transit is reflected in guandrius, troilia, and viagia. Terviagia has pejorative connotation, especially if it is perceived as a blend of terva, to make a tumult, and viagia, someone on a journey. That concludes my talk. Thank you for listening.